Well, g'day. My name is Tim Clemens and I'm the lead pastor of Grace City Church. And today, as part of our Who Am I series at Grace City, Sex, Gender and Relationships, we're conducting a few interviews with experts in their field. And so today, to help us think about transgenderism, we have Rob Smith. Rob is a lecturer at SMBC, Sydney Missionary and Bible College in Ethics, Theology and Music Ministry, also the co-author of a book, Songs of the Saints, and also happens to be doing his PhD in sex, gender and transgenderism. And so, Rob, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Tim. Good to be here.
It's great to have you with us. Tell me, we'll get into some of the official things in just a moment, but
Sure.
Tell me, why is it that you decided to do your PhD in transgenderism, this issue?
I give you a long version, but the short version is I became increasingly aware that work was needing to be done in this space, particularly from an evangelical perspective. And there just wasn't a lot of literature out there, at least that I could find at the time when I started work.
And how far through the journey are you?
I've been on it for a few years now, and I'm hoping about a year from now it'll be done and dusted and submitted. So we'll see, God willing, that nothing will slow that down. But
excellent. And the fruit, are you hoping to produce a book at the end? Is there any plans for post-PhD in this area?
I assume I'll try and turn the PhD into a book, unless someone else writes something in the meantime that really does all that I could do, and in which case it'll just remain the PhD. But the assumption is, a more accessible book will be the end result.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I've had the privilege of already reading and listening to some of your work in this area and have found it immensely helpful. So my goal really is just to pick your brains today so that others can benefit from what I've already benefited from.
Pick away.
In terms of following how we're going to pursue the interview, I was thinking maybe we'll begin just by trying to set the scene and understand transgenderism a little in general. Maybe then we'll step into thinking biblical reflection. What does the Bible say about some of these things? And then maybe we'll finish with pastoral application, some of those questions. So we'll start with kind of setting the scene. I've heard you use the phrase the transgender revolution. Can you tell us what is that? When did it start? How did we get here?
Yeah, well, look, it's not a phrase original to me. Lots of people are talking this language, both affirmingly or perhaps with more concern. But I think we are in the midst of a revolution. It's a revolution in the way we think about gender, and in particular the connection between sex and gender. Other journalists have used sort of headings like the transgender moment or the transgender tipping point. But the bottom line is we're in a new day, and there's a new ideology that's driving our culture in this regard. I can, I guess, unpack that and tell you a bit of the background if that's...
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. Basically, the essence of the new transgender ideology is that biological sex and gender identity are in no way necessarily connected. That is, just because you're biologically male doesn't tell you anything about what gender you are and what gender identity you will grow up to have or decide to choose. So it's the new ideology separates sex and gender. Now, in terms of the background to this, the roots of it, you can trace it back many centuries, really, but most significantly, I think, back to the middle of last century with the rise of French existentialist philosophy and particularly the idea that you create your essence by your existence. That's sort of the heart of existentialist philosophy. That you don't have a pre-existing essence that you live out in your existence. No, you create your essence by your existence.
So it's not determined for you, you sort of create it. Is that the difference?
That's it, it's self-made. Okay. Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, said, there is no such thing as human nature because there is no God to have a conception of it. So there's no God who's made us in a certain way to be a certain way. We make ourselves. So there, the roots of it there, that feeds into French feminism, particularly through Simone de Beauvoir, who's Sartre's lover and partner. It then refracts, I think, into sort of homosexual ideology in the 60s, particularly the idea that heterosexuality is a social construct, that therefore there's no necessary connection between, again, biological sex and sexual attraction. And then queer theory, I think, is the thing that pushes it to where we are today. It says, well, nor is there a connection between biological sex and gender identity. So everything's been pulled apart at that point.
So it feels like it's been there all along, or not all along, but certainly in the last partway through last century. But it feels like it's really amped up in the last couple of years, and it's more present than it has in the past. You use the language of tipping point.
Yeah.
Why is that? Has there something happened? Is there?
Well, I think you're right. It has been there implicitly and sort of under the surface, perhaps bubbling away. I mean, even if you go back to something like the Stonewall riots, right, 1969, New York City, which we associate with sort of gay liberation. Well, there were transgender patrons in the Stonewall bar involved in the riot. There were transgender riots around the same time happening in different parts and places. So that, the gay rights revolution and the transgender revolution have actually been tracking together and sometimes overlapping, intertwining. But of course, we've been very much aware of the gay rights revolution because it's kind of been, I guess, the front runner, and the trans revolution's been tucked in behind. But yeah, this language of tipping point is helpful because it says there has come a moment, and basically that moment was so late in 2013.
Wow.
Where the trans thing came onto centre stage.
What happened in 2013?
Well, it was a build-up of a number of things, particularly some Hollywood miniseries and things. Orange is the New Black is one that journalists often point to as being quite significant. But just a build-up of thinking, talking, literature, things in popular culture, more and more stories, more and more narratives, more and more journalistic investigation. And then, of course, you get, following on from that, things like Bruce Jenner becoming Caitlyn Jenner, and the movie The Danish Girl, which came out around a similar time. And so, a whole lot of things sort of came together to tip what people call the social imaginary into a new space and a new place. To think a brand new thought that once upon a time was, well, just unthinkable, if not silly. Think back to Monty Python's Life of Brian. They're making fun of a man who wants to be a woman, and there was a source of comedy there. Not now. Deadly serious.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so we're past the tipping point into a new day, as it were.
Wow. Okay. Now you've already used one or two phrases that, like biological sex, gender. It feels like when I listen to people talk about transgenderism, they seem to be using a whole new set of vocabulary and special words with certain kinds of meanings. Can you tell us what are some of the key words that we ought to be aware of in order to engage in a discussion about transgenderism with sensitivity and also awareness of what people are talking about?
Yeah, well, there's certainly new vocabulary. Historically, every revolution you can kind of point at, political, social, any other kind, has been accompanied by, if not preceded by, a linguistic revolution, because it's changes in language that help to birth new thoughts and therefore new ways of thinking and responding.
Words build worlds.
Yeah, exactly. So it is helpful to try and get a handle on the language, and yet the language, of course, is moving and shifting and being redefined and added to all the time. So, and almost every term I'm about to talk with you about, someone will have a different take on it.
Okay, that's helpful to know.
For most people, biological sex is straightforward. It's kind of determined by your chromosomes, with your XX or XY. Now, everyone recognises there are a very, very small number of people who have what we call intersex conditions, which often are not at the chromosomal level, but at some other level, perhaps in their genitalia or some other level there of anatomy. But the bottom line is, well, again, most people in the medical world will say, well, no, there are men and women, and then there are some people whose maleness or femaleness is somewhat ambiguous at some level. And so the people in that category are often referred to collectively as intersex people, although probably only 1% of those people are what you might call purely intersex, in that there is actually genuine ambiguity. Are they actually male or female? It's really hard to tell. In almost every other case, no, it's quite clear that whether they're male or female, it's just there is again, just some anomalies and ambiguities.
So clarification there, you've said 1% intersex. You're not saying 1% of the population are intersex, but
No, thank you.
within those called
Yeah.
intersex, 1% there is genuine uncertainty as to male or female.
Correct. I mean, you will get people who claim 1% of the population are intersex. It's more like sort of 1 in 3,000 people have an intersex condition.
And then 1% of those, there's genuine
Yeah,
ambiguity.
yeah. And yeah, that's obviously very, well, obviously concerning for the person and their
absolutely.
family, and complicated for medical people to work out, okay, well, how do we help them? Do we do anything or nothing? And
So biological sex, we've used
biological
intersex. What else do we need to be aware of?
Okay, well, gender then is perhaps the most hard or difficult to pin down term, because depending on who's using it, it can mean any number of things. But for most people, gender is now distinguished from sex. So sex is determined by your biology, whereas gender, well, the popular saying is sex is between your legs, gender is between your ears.
Okay.
Which oversimplifies it a bit, but it's your own psychological perception of where you fit in the sort of the system of male and female, men and women. People break gender then down further into gender identity, which is, again, what, who do you feel yourself to be, what do you identify as, gender expression, how you then live that out, perhaps in terms of dress and demeanour, and likewise sometimes gender role, I guess with how that works out more concretely in the world, and whether you think of yourself as man or woman, mother or father, or whatever it might be.
Yep.
Gender, you've got to double click on gender to see what is inside it, but also ask how it's being used by the person who's using it. But for most people, it's this, what you call the psychosocial outworking of sex, or at least, well, again, depending whether you connect it to sex or not, the psychosocial outworking of identity.
So there's gender identity, expression and role. What about transgenderism? What does that word mean? Who is that describing? Who would identify as transgender?
Okay, so transgender, the word trans, or the prefix trans, is from the Latin. It means on the other side of. So a transgender person is someone whose gender identity is on the other side of their biological sex. Okay, so they're perhaps unambiguously male. There's no intersex condition present with a transgender person. They're biologically male, but they feel feminine or feel like a woman, or perhaps even believe they are a woman. Again, different people make different claims. Some say this is what I want to be, others say this is what I am, but they all come under that sort of transgender sort of umbrella, that therefore my gender is on the other side of my sex.
And that refers to people who even just, they feel that way, though they may not yet or ever have taken steps towards confirming that. Or
Correct. They may do nothing about it. They just might leave it simply at that level and say, well, this is how I feel. And it's a difficult feeling, not easy to live with, but I'm not doing anything about it.
Okay.
But then others, of course, do things about it and seek to transition at one of a number of levels. Maybe it's just socially, maybe changing their name, or maybe changing their dress, or maybe even changing their birth certificate or something. It could be hormonally, in terms of then getting the hormones of the other sex. So for a male getting estrogen, or a female getting testosterone, or it could even be surgically and seeking to, as it were, sculpt the body to look like the other sex.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about gender dysphoria? Once upon a time, that was called gender identity disorder.
Yes.
What is gender dysphoria? Why have they changed the name? How do you think that's okay? What are your reflections on that?
Good question. Okay, so here's a person who's transgender. Okay, they experience a gender identity that's contrary to their sex. Now, once upon a time, they would have been described, therefore, as someone who had a gender identity disorder. So in what's called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, sort of a psychiatrist's Bible, back in the 1994 edition, I think, DSM-4, you've got gender identity disorder there. Come 2013, when the next edition comes out, DSM-5, that GID is gone. It's been replaced by this term you mentioned, gender dysphoria. Now, gender dysphoria is, again, describing a slightly different thing. It's focusing in on the distress that's generated by somebody having a gender identity that's contrary to their biological sex. So what gender dysphoria effectively says is if you have a gender identity contrary to your biological sex and it doesn't bother you, then you don't actually have any problem at all.
Yeah.
But if it does bother you, which in most cases it would, then you're experiencing gender dysphoria, and that dysphoria is the mental health concern.
Yeah.
So what DSM-5 has done effectively is to normalise gender identity disorder, or at least remove it from being a disorder. It's depathologise that incongruence, and now only pathologise the stress component. And so therapeutically, that's sort of tipped things towards doing whatever it takes to alleviate the distress. Now, in one sense, therapists have always been trying to alleviate that distress, but the previous way was to do it psychotherapeutically rather than surgically or hormonally. Whereas, well, now it seems to be much more and more the case that it's the sex change that's being recommended to alleviate the dysphoria.
And do we have any sense of how many people would experience in the population gender dysphoria?
Well, certainly I'm about to say older figure, going back a few years, that was there in DSM-5 and other literature of the time, was somewhere around about 0.25% of people experience gender dysphoria. In the last few years, since the transgender tipping point, that number is going up. A recent study in the US of teenagers put it at about 3% of teenagers identifying as a gender other than sort of man or woman. Okay. And that itself was a massive increase on the study only a couple of years earlier, which had it about 1%. So there's a 300% increase there. Just in a few years. So the number's going up, and there's again a whole range of reasons for that. Some of it may just be people coming out of the woodwork. But I think it's fair to say most of it is a result of what you might call social contagion. That is, people are being encouraged to explore and adopt all kinds of gender identities. And certainly among teenagers, there's this phenomenon they're now describing as rapid onset gender dysphoria, where teenagers who've had no particular gender issues suddenly sort of immerse themselves in YouTube stories and personal narratives of people transitioning, and all of a sudden just completely at sea about who they are and what their gender is. And so you get this phenomenon that's being more and more explored and written about, of rapid onset gender dysphoria.
I'd love to kind of double click on that, but for the sake of time I won't. Maybe last question as we're trying to set the scene. So far we've been talking about the T, if you like, in the LGBTQIA+ sometimes. Community. Tell me, does everyone in the community think the same way about sex and gender? Are there sort of different philosophies, competing philosophies even within the community? What are they?
There's a lot of competing philosophies at work, and historically there's been quite a bit of animosity and between the different letters, as it were. We talk about the LGBT+ community. It's not actually a community. I mean, it's disparate groups of people with very different ideas, and sometimes very critical of each other. Even under the T, I mean, the T is elastic enough that it picks up the Q, the queer, or the questioning. Also picks up the agender or asexual as well. One sociologist, American guy called Rogers Brubaker, he says underneath the T, the trans, you've got what he calls the trans of migration. That's people who believe in a binary system, a male-female system, and they're wanting to transition from one side to the other.
So I'm in the wrong side, I need to be on the right side.
Then you get what he calls the trans of between. That's people who see gender more as a spectrum and don't necessarily want to go from one side to the other side. They want to go from wherever they are to somewhere in between. And so you get the whole gender spectrum, gender diversity.
Facebook
gender
has however
fluidity.
many different options that you can choose for your
Facebook's
gender.
got 70-something. Tumblr's
Okay.
got 117. You
Okay.
know, there's a lot of
Yeah.
possibilities there. And then Brubaker talks about what he calls the transit beyond, which is perhaps more strictly the queer approach, which says we can transcend gender. We can go beyond it. We step outside of the system. Why do we have to be any gender? If there are not just male and female, why do we have to play that game at all? Let's jettison gender. So you've got all of that happening, sometimes under the T, but you can sort of parse that out and put some of it in the Q and some of it in the A, and so it's complicated. But I guess the bottom line is the integrating factor is, or at least what you might call the common denominator idea, is that biological sex in no way dictates or determines gender.
Okay. So we've had at least a quick attempt at trying to understand the scene, and yes, maybe things are shifting a little. You can never quite pin down where things are at, might change tomorrow, but to the degree that we can, we're trying to understand the shifting sands of our culture. One of the beautiful things of the Bible is that it's the consistent word of an unchanging God, and so maybe we'll shift into thinking about biblical reflection on some of these topics. And so tell us, what does the Bible have to say about the relationship between sex and gender?
Yeah, well, the Bible doesn't sort of use those terms the way we use them now. Obviously, it talks about males and females. It talks about men and women, and boys and girls, and fathers and mothers, and so there is, in our way of thinking of sex and gender, a lining up in Scripture between what your body tells you and who you are, and therefore what you do, can be, should be, that sort of thing. So, males grow up to be men, and if they marry, become husbands. If they have children, fathers. Females grow up to be women, and if they marry, become wives. And if they have children, all of those dots just join up in Scripture. Now, I guess activists today would say that is what you call a heteronormative or perhaps cisnormative system. Cis, just to explain that, cis is the other prefix that comes from the Latin, which means on the same side of.
As opposed to trans.
Trans on the other side of, cis on the same side of. So if someone's cisgender, then their gender and their sex just happen to line up. And so the Bible can be described as sort of promoting what you call cisnormativity, but I should warn you, cisnormativity is usually a swear word used by...
Pejorative.
By people on the other side wanting to say this is oppressive. And so I guess that the bottom line is, in their view, the Bible's teaching is oppressive, because it certainly is teaching that these things link up, that gender is simply the outworking of sex, and that then helps to direct and guide our gender expression, gender roles. Now, the Bible does that in a number of ways. I mean, sometimes it does it by means of prohibition. For example, in Deuteronomy 22:5, there's a prohibition against cross-dressing. Okay, so a man should not wear a woman's garment, and a woman not a man's clothes, and so on. So that's simply, again, a way of the Bible saying, no, this is not the way to express your gender, or at least to express your sex in terms of your gender. There needs to be consistency. Now, all of that, of course, really rests on what you might call the creation theology of Genesis 1 and 2. Where it's quite clear that God has made human beings male and female. You get these words in Hebrew in Genesis 1, Zachar and Nekavah, male and female, which then sort of get mapped onto in Genesis 2 by the words sort of man and woman, Ish and Isha, and father and mother, and husband and wife. And again, this is all part of, I guess, that lining up of sex and gender. And so, the prohibitions warn us against trying to mix that up or mess that up or blend it or bend it. You get similar passages in the New Testament which likewise sound notes of warning against, for example, men effeminizing themselves, either in behaviour or particularly in sexual behaviour. Even 1 Corinthians 11, you've got the famous and somewhat perhaps confusing or complex passage about women and men and hairdressing. And
we looked at that as a church a month or two ago. So
okay,
we had fun with that.
You've sorted that all out, But again, I think what the driving concern of the apostle there is he doesn't want to see the Christians in Corinth sort of blurring their gender distinctions, but embracing them and living them out to God's glory. And for each other's good.
So, biblically, we rest in the creation account. A biological man or a male is a boy, grows into a man, possibly a father. So there's kind of this alignment between sex and gender. They're not two separate things, they're the same.
Yeah.
And yet some people continue to experience this dysphoria. Now,
Correct.
Can you help us understand what role does the fall in the Bible play about how we think of these things?
Yeah, well, the fall plays a huge role because it makes everything enormously complicated and introduces distortions and disorders and dysfunctions and disfigurements and disabilities and dysphoria. Okay, so if we're asking why are things messy, well, it's because sin and death have entered the world and messed them up. And so, yes, we do have people born with, well, not just intersex conditions, but all kinds of bodily abnormalities. And we have people, of course, who have all kinds of psychological disorders. People who have anorexia nervosa, or what's called body integrity identity disorder, where they think I shouldn't have this arm. I'm not meant to have a right arm. And then you've got perhaps the most sort of total form of that is again gender incongruence or gender identity disorder. Where they think I've got the wrong body, not just this bit of the body, but the whole body is wrong. It's meant to be something else. And all of that, I think, is a consequence of sin, not the person's sin necessarily. I think that's important to clarify. There's a biblical category of affliction and disease and all kinds of things that is non-moral in the sense that these are not manifestations of people's sins or even the result of particular sins. They're just part of human brokenness. And there are lots of forms of brokenness, and this is one, to be afflicted with gender incongruence or gender dysphoria, just like having an intersex condition might also be another version of that. So the fall is very important to understand because it does explain the mess.
I might ask you more about the affliction in a little bit when we get to some pastoral reflection time.
Yeah.
But kind of before we get there, can we just think again? There's an alignment between sex and gender. How ought we to respond, just a quick practical question, to someone who has undergone or born a male but wants to be referred to as a female? How should we use those pronouns? Yes, no, why not, given what you're saying about kind of creation sort of aligns the two? Yeah.
Well, if I can creep up on that question simply by saying, I think in light of Scripture's, not just the creation theology, but again the various commands and prohibitions as well, there's a consistent call there toward alignment, which for many people is uncomplicated, but for some people very complicated. But just because something's complicated and difficult doesn't change the call. So I think we are called to welcome the body God's given us and learn to live in line with it. And obviously for the person with gender incongruence, there's a profound temptation to not do that and to resent the body they've been given and perhaps to try and change it or to pretend it's not what it is. And so, again, one of the ways a person might do that is by changing their name and wanting pronouns that would apply appropriately if they had a different body, but don't actually apply to the body they have. Now, should we comply with that, I guess, is the question, or should
And there might be a slightly different, well, maybe not, but is there a slightly different response if it's, say, a member of our church who's wrestling with these things versus, hey, it's a colleague at work. They want me to change how I refer to them. That's the particular kind of thing I'm thinking.
Yeah, and the Scripture is quite clear. I think we treat those outside the body of Christ a little differently to those inside the body of Christ, in that those outside the body of Christ need to come to Christ. And those who have come to Christ then need to learn how to live in a way that pleases the Lord. Whereas those who don't yet know him not only are not motivated to do that, but don't actually have the Spirit's power to do that. So the priority with the non-Christian person is to bring them to Jesus. And to that, for that reason, I would be open to what people call pronoun compliance, But my preferred option, if I can achieve it, is just pronoun avoidance. Because frankly, when you're talking to someone, you almost never use pronouns. When you're talking about someone, you'll use pronouns. And so I guess the challenge comes if you're talking about them and they're in their presence. So when I'm with a transgender person, and say that we're in a cafe and they bring the coffee out and they say, right, who's this, the cappuccino? Well, I can say, oh, that's for them. Yeah. Or even just use their name. So there are, again, ways of avoiding the issue. Now, why would you avoid the issue? Well, I do think it's important not to tell lies. Although, again, you could argue there's a greater thing at stake here in terms of relationship and bringing the person to Jesus. But again, every time you use a false pronoun for someone, it kind of reinforces a false belief. And I think we know enough now about what they call neuroplasticity, and there's certainly enough people who've detransitioned from having changed genders who say actually it's actually not helpful to keep feeding the delusion or the desire a person has to be another sex, another gender. Again, it doesn't mean you go full on resistance and make a scene, but therefore if you can find a path of avoidance, I think that's actually best.
Okay. Now, someone who's experiencing gender dysphoria might often say, I feel like I'm a man trapped in a woman's body. Yeah. I feel like I'm a woman trapped in a man's body.
Yeah.
This is not a question about what would you say to them. Yeah. It's just a question, theologically, how does the Bible conceive of that? Is that possible?
Well, I don't think it's a reality. There's certainly no evidence that anyone's ever produced or even argument that suggests that's a reality. But it's certainly a genuine feeling. Just as the anorexic genuinely feels that they're obese, and the person with body dysmorphia that generally feels that they shouldn't have a limb. You've got to take those feelings seriously, not dismiss them, because they're real and they're painful and they're profound. And so they ought to evoke in us great compassion, because here's a person who's got a very difficult to bear affliction, to use the word we used earlier. And they need love and understanding and support and all else to help to work out how to bear that and how to live with that, and perhaps, God willing, how to help alleviate that.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, let's try and shift, if we can, from, we've sort of tried to set the scene to a degree. We've reflected something on what are some of the key building blocks or foundations in the Bible for thinking about sex and gender. Let's now, and we've sort of drifted into it, but let's now talk application. What would you say, or what should I say, if someone comes to me at church and says, I'm feeling gender dysphoria, I'm feeling like there's a disconnect between if they use the language, biological sex, my gender identity. I'd love this, maybe if we can, what should I say as a pastor to someone at my church? But maybe also what should a parent say to their child? I sense that they might be two different things.
Sure. Well, just to preface what I'm about to say, I heard a tragic story the other day of a woman who had such a conversation with her pastor many years ago, and came to a moment of courage and shared her struggle with gender dysphoria, and the pastor walked her to the gate of the church and invited her not to come back.
Wow.
So that's what not to do.
Yeah. Okay. I'll make a little note of that. Yeah.
The first thing you'd want to say is, gosh, that must be really difficult. Thank you for sharing this painful struggle with me. This must be a very, very tough thing to bear. And so just register that immediately, that they've shared something profoundly significant with you. That hasn't obviously been easier to share, and it's a source of great pain and distress. Now, depending on how well you know them and where they want to go from there, I mean, you can certainly then ask, I guess, historic questions. Is this something recent, or is this something you've felt all your life, or is it something that's come and gone? and you'll get different answers, of course, because they distinguish between early onset, mid onset, late onset gender.
And rapid onset.
Rapid onset, yes. These things can come at different times for different people and come and go. So I guess just see where the conversation goes from there. But I presume the person's sharing this because they really want help and support and perhaps advice as well. And so we can get to that in a second. With parents, of course, well, in some ways the response should be similar. Although
I'm thinking, is there a slight difference between, say, someone pre-puberty and some of the advice that might be given about puberty blockers? So just there's a whole way of thinking about children as opposed to maybe adults that might come and approach me. Yeah.
Now, well, here's a few things to know about children. First of all, gender exploration is actually a fairly normal part of childhood. None of us sort of arrive, in the delivery room thinking, "Hey, I'm a boy," or "Hey, I'm a girl." We've got no idea who we are. We don't know anything. That's something we're going to discover. Okay, God's given us a body, and we become more and more aware of that. And in relation with parents and others, we start to pick up clues and cues about, okay, this means I'm a boy, or this means I'm a girl. And so the development of sex and gender awareness it's something that happens slowly throughout childhood. And for many people, most people, it happens fairly straightforwardly, but not for everybody. For some people, they kind of get a little confused and mixed up along the way. And so it's not surprising that kids take a little while to settle, or some kids do. And it can be also exacerbated if they just happen to like certain games that perhaps aren't stereotypically boys' games, and they're a boy, and think, well, what does that mean? I'm a boy, how come I don't like this game the other boys seem to like? And I actually prefer this activity that the girls seem to like.
So maybe highlight some of the danger of too rigid stereotypes around gender.
Absolutely, that is one of the great problems that we've inflicted on ourselves, to tie people up in knots and to put them in these tight boxes, and so that their tastes are somehow meant to be determining their gender. I mean, it's very unhelpful. So parents often advise just not to be overly kind of thrown and concerned, but to say, oh, okay, well, tell me about this and let's talk about it, and perhaps help them navigate through whatever the source of the confusion is. Perhaps, again, it comes back simply to games, or, again, there are lots of reasons why children can get confused. Again, perhaps all their other siblings are of the other sex, or perhaps they've internalized a belief, rightly or wrongly, that their parents wanted a girl when they're a boy, or a boy, there's lots of different reasons. But the good news is, and even the DSM-5 puts these stats out there, that a very, very high number of percentage of children who have gender issues resolve them by adolescence. Again, different studies will give you a different figure, but somewhere in the 90%. Right? Wow. So that's a comforting stat for parents who are worried, just to know that the norm is for children to figure this out. And certainly the onset of puberty, and it kind of pushes things to a bit of a crisis if they haven't got resolved by then. Sadly, today, that natural resolution period is now being interfered with by kids being put onto puberty blockers. Well, first of all, told, the reason you're confused is because you're actually transgender, and then put onto puberty blockers, and then put onto cross-sex hormones at whatever the legal age is for that, and so if you've got now kids as young as 16, as a girl recently had a double mastectomy at 16, and you think this person's not even old enough to vote or to drive, and they've now made a permanent decision about a problem that would probably have resolved if they'd actually just, as it were, been left alone or gently guided. And even some of the most ardent activists are quite candid about the fact that sex change surgery is a temporary solution to a psychological problem. So there's a lot of honesty, at least in some of the people in the trans world, and particularly medical people who've actually are responsible medical people and have looked at the studies and the stats and the follow-ups and seen, okay, this actually doesn't really solve the problem. It can buy some time and create a honeymoon period for some people, but often whatever the underlying issues are will re-emerge down the track. And so the instance of sex change regret is now becoming more and more apparent. And
can I ask a question on that? Suppose I play devil's advocate for a moment.
Sure.
I go, yeah, okay, you're just telling me that because of your heteronormative story arc that you stick to, and you're just citing the few examples of where people regret transgression. Sorry, what's the language? What am I?
Well, regret transitioning.
Transitioning. And so they will step back. Are there stories out there of, I presume there are, of people who, no, this is the best thing I ever did?
There are.
Do we know the percentage?
It's enormously difficult to get accurate figures, although, again, more and more work is being put in to try. But there was a sort of summary study that came out recently, or at least an article that summarised a range of studies, which just had the title something like, the best studies show the worst outcomes.
Yeah.
In other words, the most responsible, reliable, neutral of studies that have been done, and there's quite a range of them, actually show that this is not working out for most people. Now, there will be some people who have long-term happiness, but they're the exception. Yeah. More normal for people to have short-term happiness. Again, there are people who have immediate regret, but they're a minority. Most have a period of happiness, but somewhere between sort of 3 and 10 years that seems to fall apart. Okay. For most. Again, there's always exceptions.
Yeah. Now we're going to have to wrap things up shortly. 1 or 2 more questions, if I may. I suppose the first question would be, so someone is experiencing gender dysphoria. What are appropriate ways, what are inappropriate ways for them to manage their dysphoria, and for us, so as the Christian community, to come alongside and support them in that? Yeah, well,
going back to what we said earlier, if it is really God's will, and I have no doubt about this myself, that God's will that we live in line with our sex, so therefore our gender, identity, expression, roles really follow from our sex, then, well, pursuing what you might call a transgender way of being is not what God has called the believer to, even though it may be profoundly alluring and tempting and offer the solution. And this, again, it's helpful to hear the studies and stats that are coming out to say, actually, that promise of hope is very fragile, if not illusory. But that aside, God is calling you this way, not that way. So we want to encourage the person to hear that, embrace that, and then do anything and everything possible to support them in that. Now, again, a lot of the people who do transitions have said to me, don't buy the advice that some people give that it's okay to do a bit of cross-dressing, that's fairly, it's non-invasive, it's fairly harmless. Their consistent word is, no, it's not harmless. It actually messes with your neuroplasticity, it kind of feeds the fire and perpetuates the problem rather than helping you to move towards resolution. And now, having said that, again, we need to, avoid the narrow gender stereotypes. As if all women have to wear dresses and have long hair, and all men must.
Problem in Scotland where they wear skirts sometimes.
Exactly. Well, that's right. And so there is a cultural element to all these things, and certainly within our culture here in Australia and more broadly in the West, there is a range of ways of being a man and a range of ways of being a woman, and some of them, to use these terms, may be kind of more towards the masculine end, and others more towards the feminine end, but they're uncomplicatedly and not in a way that's confusing for people, still ways of being either a man or a woman. And I think, good, well, there is some breathing room there, okay? And it, again, applies to tastes and activities and music and art and whatever, all the things that that people sometimes link up with gender, which probably shouldn't ever be linked up with gender. They're just things people like.
Yeah.
And so, within that range, I think, there's freedom for people to explore. And if they're more comfortable being this kind of man than that kind of man, or this kind of woman than that kind of woman, hallelujah. God's given you that freedom. You don't have to be up here, you can be there. But there is a boundary between masculine and feminine and male and female, and that's the boundary the Lord says, no, that's not for you to cross. I want you to live in line with how I've made you, and to embrace that gift. It is a gift. Now, again, for some people, that may be enormously difficult and complicated and full of challenges. And again, it's going to be different in every case, because the reasons for people's gender dysphoria are different in every case. And sometimes the reasons are almost impossible to figure out. In other cases, no, you can pinpoint the problem, as it were, and begin to address the problem. So we need patience, love, wisdom, lots of prayer, lots of support, walking with people as fellow sinners, sufferers, people who are broken in a myriad of ways, in terms of our sexuality, our identity. There mustn't be any high-handedness, judgmentalism, superiority. Just none of that's helpful, none of it's appropriate. We've got to walk together, work together, love together.
Maybe a final question, if I may. What is the Christian message to someone who has already sought transition, whether that's socially, hormonally, surgically?
Sure. As a Christian, you mean, or someone who's now a Christian?
I think someone, let's say not yet a Christian.
Okay, well, not yet a Christian.
Someone comes to church, they've transitioned. What is our approach? What is our message to them?
Well, firstly, welcome. Great you're here. We're very glad you feel free to join with us. And our greatest hope is to introduce you to the Lord Jesus, who is, everything to us, and the one who gives us life. Now, so that's your number one priority goal.
Yeah.
To help a person come to the Lord of life and find themselves in Him. Because coming to Christ opens up all kinds of new possibilities of self-acceptance, of being open to the Lord telling us who we are, not ourselves or our culture telling us who we are, coming to accept our body with whatever problems it might have and whatever, coming to wrestle them with the challenges at a psychological level, whatever they might be. So they need to come to Christ first, and then He says, okay, now take my yoke upon you and learn from me.
Yeah. And
so we then walk the path of discipleship from there. I wouldn't be trying to, well, I mean, look, a non-Christian person may want help with their gender issues. Okay, great. Well, find the best help you can for them to grapple with that. But from a spiritual point of view and a ministerial point of view, our number one goal is for them to come into the kingdom and meet the Lord.
And let Him meet Him, He will define who they are, and then you walk with them, as we do with all of us, really.
All of us, that's right.
And continuing to be be into His image and likeness and who we are in His sight.
So it's a parallel with the person who's got same-sex attraction, or perhaps been in a homosexual community lifestyle. It's a parallel there. Okay, they need to come to the Lord, be born again, and then learn to live worthy.
Yeah. Beautiful. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been enormously enlightening. So thank you again, and we'll finish up there. Thanks again.
Tim.